Okay, folks, we're gathering to go to Dunleera. And those days, all services went to the pillar, unlike today. So when we're coming into O'Connell Street, and we see this lovely luxury tram built in 1932. And we love the sign on the side of it. Your throat's sake, smoke craven A. The fact that your lungs have been destroyed apparently doesn't matter. And that is the 30, that's going to turn down North Earl Street and go direct to Clontarf. Okay. Yeah, move on. Now there's the team set for the rush hour. The 8, of course, to Dalkey, the 7 to Dunleary, the 14 to Upper Rathmines, and the 15 to Terranure. And 1, 2, 3, 3 of them are luxury. The 4 of them are luxury trams. That's unusual. They were built in Inchicore works, not like today's trams, by blacksmiths, cabinet makers, and the rest of it. And they were utterly superb. And they could take tremendous loads. And when the emergency got going, there was a rule that there was only supposed to be 5 standing. 55 would be nearer the point. Okay.
Sean, what was the specifics of the luxury tram?
The luxury tram was just a new design, 1932, 1934.
Okay. Yeah.
The other trams, as you'll see, some of them were great famous trams that were built in 1900 and they were still banging away in 1950. Right, next slide. Yeah, now as we approach the pillar from the back, we see the depot of the 31 and the 30. In other words, one goes to Howth and the other goes to Dollymount, to Clontarf. And they're lovely. They loaded up there, taking their time. As you see, you were helped down by the conductor. And then he got very gently advised you about your fare and what have you, and he got on after you.
Was this a summertime shot, John, with the white cap, the white top to the cap?
Oh, the white cap was summertime, yeah. They had to follow old army European conditions. Yeah, so you had to have a white top in the summer. Now, this is the emergency at its height. You see the queue coming round, and that queue went the whole way back to O'Connell Bridge. And those trams loaded up slowly. Now, the 6th tram for Blackrock, that's one of the ones that were built for the Lucan line in 1900. And there it is doing its thing in 1950. And when you got in, comfortably sitting down in that tram, sometimes the little conductor came up, excuse me, folks, we won't be leaving for 2 hours. And when you desperately say, why? The meter man, there was somewhere in the back there was a CIE office and there was a meter registering how much power was available. And there was fellas in the works, the generating station was in Bod's Bridge. European Motors, you'd know it as in later days, shoveling away, trying to generate a small amount of current. And eventually the conductor would say, we're off. And before that, he'd have said, there's a lovely chip shop over there if you want to get a bag of chips. So anyway, after sitting for an hour and a half, you were told, we're off. And off you went to Blackrock or Dalkey in 50-year-old trams. We're diverging a little bit. This is a famous view of Sandymount Tower. On the left-hand side, you have bring your parcels and hand in your parcel and sixpence, and it'll be delivered to someone waiting for it at the pillar. And then the Martello Tower, of course, tickles me. The Brits here were building them like the clappers to keep Napoleon out. And all our street ballads were saying prayers to Napoleon to come with his army quickly. And on the right-hand side, you have the horse trough. That was there for the horses coming in the morning from the Wicklow Hills with vegetables for the city. But the maid from the big house has come out on the road to rinse her sheets in the water that the horses are going to drink. And there she is, rinsing out her chutes. That's a lovely scene. Okay, next. Who knows where there is? That is Harcourt Street, the entrance to Harcourt Street Station, with a lovely collection of six-wheelers. And of course, like everywhere else that was shut, the nice new electrical signal cabin has been installed, and a colour light system. You have to do that before you close the line. So next. This is Carrickmines. Lovely station on the southeastern, second or third, fourth station out, I think, with all modern station convenience. It was just a main station for the very nice people at that stage who lived in big houses. Carrickmines was covered with very, very large mansions and large land holdings. There was little or no small domestic houses of any sort. Right? That was the station of Dundrum at its best. And on the signal cabin, slightly to the left, if you can read it, there's a big sign on the face of the signal cabin that caused absolute trouble in the press in Dublin in 1946 or 7 or so. It refers to St. Columba's College, and it also refers to nice young Protestant gentlemen get off here for St. Columba's. And I was good friends with Dr. Sims, and Dr. Sims and a couple of others got very vicious and had the sign removed. And the only thing remained was Columba's College. And that's that big sign on the face of the signal cabin. But Dundrum was a very finely laid out station. And there's an old saying that the signal on the bridge of the road caused more heart failures than the rest of the heart failures in the country. When you were anywhere from the village of Dundrum down the main road and you saw that signal fall, you realized that you had half a minute to make the station. So you went like hell. And of course, often collapsed with a weak heart, right? And here we're coming into Milltown Station. If nice young ladies get off here, there was sports fields and that relevant to the girls' colleges. And a nice view of 343. Okay. And this was the revolution. That's Dundrum Station. Sorry, not Dundrum, Foxrock Station. And they're setting up the new silver A-class, C-class, with the new coaches for the new service that they were about to install. And they had all stops going, except for one thing. The C-class couldn't be started. And their new fleet of 30-odd C-class that were going to work the system were Judds. They were eventually rebuilt completely with American mechanisms. And they worked for the first 6 or 7 years that they were on the track. It was a financial disaster. And as far as I know, no one ever got shot for it. It was the fleet of new locomotives that were going to put on it. And that, by the way, was a decisive factor in the very short notice closing of the Harcourt Street line. Just the new trains wouldn't work. I don't know of any other railway position that landed in that. The new trains wouldn't work, so we shut the system. Otherwise, we'd have had to admit that we ordered 30 locomotives that wouldn't work for a colossal sum of money that wouldn't work. This is 850. And we as students, schoolboys, we used to keep an eye on the gasometer on the left. The top bit floated up and down, and we realized someday it was practically empty, so there'll be no heat for the tea gas, gas was developed and used under very short notice. So when we passed that, we looked at the top floating piece and we knew what the position was, and sometimes it was disastrous. 850, of course, unfortunately, it was supposed to be the greatest locomotive ever built, and it wasn't so. It had faults and it caused a lot of problems. However, it was very pictorial, and it was the only engine we had on the Dublin South Eastern with outside valve gear. This is 334, the heavy inch-core locomotive stationed at Canal Street for the Rosslare Express. Now, I'm being a bit generous when I use the word express, but you get the message. It was a fast train to Rosslare, and it provided a very good service because the engines were they were a very good class of engine. They were very tough and very strong. Now this is the businessman's evening train, the best of the stock that the Dublin South Eastern had. 6 coaches, the middle 2 were first class. And it went 5 minutes to Blackrock from Western Row platform. It had to leave Blackrock on 6 minutes. So it was 5 or 5.5 minutes into the platform of Blackrock from Western Row. It wasn't bad going. Because when it was coming out, the pedestrian gates on each place, there was about 4 of them. They were all opened in preparation before the train appeared at all. And the train came through then like a bullet. And that engine, of course, was Wicklow in earlier days. It had a name and was beautifully turned out. But it was still working well in 1950, 1948. These were in Ballsbridge siding as late as 1949, and would you believe at that stage they were taken away and broken up. 36 survives, of course, that's the engine in front. But there were 2 classic original Dublin Kingstown coaches. And there were those with the foresight at the time and just broke them up. Now, this was another site you're missing today. There was a very heavy duty of cattle trains, both empties and loaded. The famous cattle yards were up over the South Circle, the North Circle Road. And they were served by great cattle fairs in Gorey and then Escorty. And after each fair, there was 8 or 9 of these specials used to come up loaded with cattle. We won't go into the cruelty degrees that these cattle were subjected to, but that's another story. On your left there, you have a tiny signal cabin for the pier, for the West Pier. It had its own little cabin and a level crossing. And that engine was Wexford in other days. And of course, then you have the colour light signal. Before you completely rebuild as a CI, you have to replace an up-to-date, very sophisticated colour light system, and then you wreck it. It was wrecked, of course, because the new diesel system came in, or the new electric system. Okay. You have to bow in front of that. That's Carlisle Pier at its best.
Sorry, John, that picture with this, the light signal, what year was that? I'm just curious when the first light signals came to Ireland.
The first light system, the Dublin South Eastern had the magnificent light system. It was exactly the same, David, as your OO railway. It was track circuited. It worked completely on track circuiting.
Mm.
And when there was a train on the section, it just went red. That was, you asked me the question, when was that fitted? All the pieces were ready and were cut off during the war. And then they were eventually fitted in the immediate aftermath of the war, 1946 to 48.
Okay, thank you.
Not at all.
Sorry, Joe has a question.
Sorry, John. The locomotive there has a fine covered-in cab. What locomotive was that, please?
Cork.
Cork.
Two very heavy 060s bought by the Dublin Southeastern. One was named Dublin and the other was named Cork.
Thank you very much.
For the night goods.
Night goods.
It was a religion. At 8 o'clock every evening, the night goods left Dublin going south and the night goods left Wexford coming north. And when we lived in Wicklow for a while, I went to sleep about midnight to the sound of the night goods climbing the bank out of Rathdrum. And that was sort of absolute. If you wouldn't go to sleep if the night goods hadn't come.
It looks like a 4F, but it has a fine cab in it as well there, as we see.
Yeah, no, it has as you say, it has a proper cabin for Ireland. The point is that some of the other divils hadn't a good cabin for Ireland. He's comfortably looking out through his window.
He is indeed. Thanks very much for that.
They were lovely engines. Oh no, don't thank me, Ray. And now this is Carlisle Pier. As you can see, they've mounted 2 cranes on the roof. This is very late day. This was where an effort to get into the car transporting business. And your car was driven onto a stretcher. And it was lifted up and banged on the side of the sheds and whatnot. The same happened in England. It just had this crane built in at massive expense. There's one on the right as well as the left. And your car was driven onto this stretcher and you stood beside it. Don't scratch it, don't scratch it. And they ignored you and they lifted it and the car swung in if it was a windy day, your beautiful car swung in the breeze and hit the sidewall of the station. And the porters weren't responsible, so they didn't worry too much. I don't know whether the fellas ever got recompense for their scratched cars, but if you wanted to bring a car to England, that was the only way to bring it at that time. And then, of course, they never made up their mind about all these buildings on the left and the right. No sooner had they been finished time and again, and they just knocked them down and reshaped them completely. They never made up their mind about either the track structure or the buildings in Carlisle. And of course, eventually, as you know, the council just walked in and wrecked. Carlisle had one magnificent feature. The underlay of the ballast and everything else was fitted on a series of gears. It was never solid. And Dunleary Harbour is famous for a great big drift of water in front of the wind, coming in and maybe 6 to 10 foot deep. And it wrecked various places and yacht clubs. But in Carlisle, it just came in and came up through the track because there was allowance for it and up through the platform. And then the tide went out and everything was perfect. But now, of course, Carlisle is a derelict thing and no one knows what to do with it. And the most peculiar ideas have been put forward to, and of course, building the Stena Pier then made it totally obsolete. And as you know, Stena has come and gone. And I think Stena would have, now, this is just to remind you of what Dunleary, or as some would call it then, Kingstown, was like in its best days. The whole formation, thank you, the whole formation on the left-hand side, of course, was knocked for a shopping centre. That thing on the corner is a huge bank. And it was knocked on this huge shopping centre built, a shopping centre that no one wanted. But people in England decided we were going to get it. And all those lovely little shops, self-contained little shops with their living accommodation upstairs, was all knocked down to build this huge monolith. But however, there were those who knew best. And okay, we'll head on. This is the Rosslare Mail. Half of it has gone on the Harcourt Street line, and this is the other half of it coming into Amiens, into Westland Row. Again, we have one of these 330 class locomotives, very powerful, very reliable. Behind the tender, you have one of the smaller post vans of 1890, by the way, this is 1950, and he was built in 1890. But however, he did the job, and there's our famous colour light signals again. A three aspect, of course. Okay. This is as things were in 1936, 37. You've obviously a brigade of scouts and very natty cars of the day, and they're off on some continental scout holiday. And of course, you have two boats. I identified them one time. Scotia's one, and Hibernia was the other one. And they were hard-working steam engine ships. And unlike the Stena, they rode out the winter storms by putting their nose into them. They were brilliant sea boats. But that meant that you got tossed up and down a bit more than the modern boats, but you were secure. And of course, if you're someone in a railway question time won money one time, that there were two turntables on Carlisle Pier, and there's the second one there. The other one is at the end of the pier. Right? Oh, I'm allowing that some of you, and of course, taking a friend Eric, some of you would come in from the north in a steam rail car, a lovely steam rail car train in the original formation, with a lovely little locomotive in front, number 2, and the carriages were another part of a steam rail car, but that's a lovely little steam rail car coming in from the north, when everything should have been driven by steam. Go on. We're taking a divergence here, a couple of little stories. Release the prisoners, of course. Kerry was savage during the Civil War, and the prisoners weren't released in the mid-30s. And then, of course, some fellas started firing the gun again, and some more people were put back in. So someone has come along and renewed the sign that was on the wall. Mind you, he isn't the greatest at printing, as you can see. But there we are with the Dingle train coming in across Castle Street. And we're now in Dingle. It was an amazing thing. There was a monthly cattle train, and after a monthly fair, I should say, and after the fair, there was 2 or 3 trains, huge trains of cattle, to be delivered, and to see that banging up across the mountains was out of this world. But unfortunately, there was a fellow named Gleason, and he left the Trinity and Dingle, and he went to Chicago, and he's in a block of concrete flats in a raging rainstorm one day, and when he looks out the window, there's a similar window looking at him, and he wrote, the sea, the sky, oft times in my dreams I'm in Tralee. The sea, the sky, and a small train struggling gallantly across the mountains high. A ghost from out the past, a vision from out the years, climbing the sides of Glownagalt like an old man full of tears. It's absolutely magnificent.
And John,
And that was the Trinity and Dingle.
Quite American there with
yeah.
your and your Mars light, as the Americans called it.
Oh yeah. The joke was that you had to get up. Someone asked, with that great big headlamp, did it yield any light? And a famous fireman said, well, you have to climb around the front of the engine when you're moving to see if it's gone out or if it's lighting. So that tells you. It was an oxy lamp.
Carbide, oxyacetylene, or
they eventually oxyacetylene. They eventually became wonderful keep things by the market, you know, and they were all swiped very quickly. Sort of in 1948, 49, the moneyed people, the collectors took over, and all sorts of things like those lamps just vanished overnight before fellas like me could swipe one.
Joe raised your hand again.
What?
No, that was me on raising my hand. Sorry. Apologies.
Okay.
Okay. I just threw in now a couple of lovely. These eventually finished as magnificent steamers. They were built to a very poor design with 4 cylinders, and they were rebuilt with bigger boilers, and then they were rebuilt the second time with 2 cylinders. And as such, they became magnificent workers and very, very fast engines, and very popular with us guys. My friend Drew Donaldson filled books of timings with them, right up to 97 miles per hour, that is. And they were lovely. And of course, just the day came when they were replaced by A-class. And the A-class, again, like the C-class, couldn't be started. And when they were started, they were liable to go on fire. So we had to put up with that. That would be the age of 1956 to 1966. Those silver diesels come between me and my sleep. I'd love to see someone stood against the wall and shot, and no one was shot for it. And just a colossal quantity of money was spent for these non-starting engines. Right? And this, of course, is the radio train for the Yanks and others. Well, that was frequented an awful lot by retired people in Dublin. My dear friend Charlie Haughey had introduced the free travel pass. Everyone has an awful lot to say against Charlie. But Charlie did a whole lot of things when he had no money to play with. Number one was the free television for the old people. And also the free travel pass was one of the greatest things that ever happened. 2 old retired people living in Dublin just took a little walk and went down to Tralee for the day and back in the evening, just as a day out with their free travel pass. It was an amazing thing for the older people and the older people who weren't that well off. So while Charlie hadn't big money to give around, he altered things like that made a hell of a difference to the older people and the poorer people. Right? This has an effect on me rather like the silver A-class. This is 459, who was a good, respectable engine on the Dublin Southeastern days for the boat trains. It is here driven by Willie Fortune. And Willie weighed in at 34 stone. And he had to be helped to get in over the tanks when it was his turn to drive. And the joke was that the engine would haul another coach when Willie was aboard, meaning that the adhesion was much better. And then, of course, the engine was fitted with Bulleid's automatic smoke box cleaner. The less said about that, the better. There was a valve which used to open and close depending on the heat, but eventually the valve used to always seize and stay half open, in which case it was impossible to get the engine to steam properly. And Bulleid fitted about 6 engines on the Dublin Southeastern with these automatic smoke box adjusters. Someone should have fitted one to him. Okay. This is a lovely shot. The 500, arguably the best steam engine for given duty in Ireland. They weren't as heavy on the adhesion, they weren't as heavy on the wheels, and then there were 6 driving wheels, so they could outhaul most 440s. They could outhaul all 440s, and they were Bazins, free-flowing 2 cylinders, so they were very, very fast and very, very economical. They were quite brilliant. There was 3 of them. And here we have them coming out of the Phoenix Park Tunnel. And that's the evening of the Pioneer Special, the biggest crowd ever in Croke Park. because they weren't just in the stands, they were standing on the playing grounds. Was the centenary of the pioneer movement. In other words, a movement for non-drinkers. And this, from every village in Ireland, these great trains, cars and buses hadn't come back yet. These huge trains brought this huge crowd to Croke Park. It was rated at 150,000, the biggest crowd ever in Croke Park. And the 500s were part of it, bringing the Kerry and Cork specials. I know we had to face with the 500s being replaced by the non-starting A class. For observers, it was sickening. There you have the first six-wheel coach is a special from the Middle and Great Western, the Clifton, the Clifton Galway Express, built in 1900. And there he's working in late 1940s. He's 50 years old, but no problem. Next. This just goes back a bit further on the Carlisle Pier. As you see, there's a very good selection of very upper class cars and very finely dressed people. There's no gazebos at all of the normal citizens running about. For the slower, there's a Jarvie, a horse Jarvie. And of course, again, there's two of the that's the earlier class, the Leinster class. Right. Here we have the Hibernia of the period, a beautiful, and she's a steamship. And no matter how rough the sea is, those ships used to go. And when we saw replacement, the Stena boats and that, if the sea was too rough, the Stena wouldn't sail. But they went come hell or high water.
John, were they turbine?
No, reciprocating.
Thank you.
They were honest to God steam engines. They were capable of 23 or 24 knots. And the trick was when one came at the height of the emergency, when one came in, the great trick was to get a couple of bags of coal out of it. There was no coal in Ireland, no real coal available. So there's many a character. The crew, the fire room crew, a lot of them were Dunlearyites. They used to try to go home with a bag of coal on their back, which caused problems, but it's very understandable. Right, next, John. I just put that in for when things were as God should have had them. 3 800s in Glanmire, having bring down the Archbishop Cushing specials. The Archbishop Cushing specials were a huge party of, they called them pilgrims, came from Boston. And they were on their way to Lourdes. You see, there was no aeroplanes then. So they came by boat, they landed at Cove, and they made us an express run to Dublin, and they went then via the railway line across England and on their way. And everywhere, as far as I could see, they lived it up very capably. Parties and what have you, but who was I to question it?
But John, pilgrims always did that. Just look back to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales.
Absolutely, absolutely. So to go on a pilgrimage, you didn't really need your rosary beads and your prayer book. What you needed was a lot of money. And they lived it up. I saw them staggering out of the train. And as the fella said, anyone who looked less like a pilgrim, as two porters held them up from falling under the train. But there we are. And all, of course, all those three beauties built from raw materials in Inchicore. Inchicore couldn't make a tin of sardines today.
And John, they all have double
But they-
funnels.
Oh,
They all
double
have
chimneys,
double
chimneys.
chimneys.
But they had a unique effort, unlike any British or French jobs. The cylinders exhausted directly to the chimney. All the others had a chamber that the cylinders used to exhaust into, and that chamber used to feed the chimney. But the 800s had Breeden's own idea. He had his own idea that it would be better if they exhausted direct, and the inside cylinder used to exhaust in the back funnel, and the outside cylinders used to exhaust in the foot. And when she had proper coal in 1949 and 1950, before the coal vanished, they produced amazing figures. They were wonderful performers. They did a little after the Second World War, but we never got real Welsh coal again. I put that in for a certain character, a friend of mine who rather likes northern engines. That was the typical northern engine that did the night goods to Everett, to Belfast and other northern places every night.
That's a PG, isn't it, John?
A B is on the cab.
I think there's a PG.
What does that mean?
The B is the haulage classification. A, B, C, and D.
Yeah.
And then they went to E, which is actually back again. So it's a long story.
Yeah,
But I think
they were lovely, lovely, tough, well-designed engines. Right? Now, this is a nasty job. This shows the queues. A huge army of people used to go to England in the emergency. The emergency was 1945, while England was rebuilding completely. And there was huge amounts of work available in England. And the unemployed here all got on the mailboat and went to England. And there you see them queuing. Now, there was an interesting thing. You see 4 or 5 people walking up the platform. They had boarding cards. In other words, they were nice people and so had some connection somewhere. I never really got the full control of the boarding card. But they're walking on the boat past the big long queue. And shortly before sailing, the boat had 100 or 2 of people with boarding passes. And then if I came down the platform, the boat gangway, and shouted 200 or 100. In other words, there was 100 places available, and the queue then was fed in 100 places. And if you didn't get on the queue, you had no option but to sit there until the morning boat to maintain your position in the queue, because you didn't have the money to go and stay in local night shop or anything else. So you sat patiently in the rain to hold your place for the morning boat. Because in the queue, you'd see just small families and working chaps. Your internet connection is unstable, I tell you. Very good. Now, there's the same thing. As you see, the huge queue goes back the whole way past the yacht clubs. And in the quay, you have the new Cambria. And the 2 of them are there, the Cambria and the Hibernia. I used to look on those as sissies. They were diesel boats, not in my aura at all. I'm surprised I have a photograph of one. I do have a photograph of the other one. And there you have the huge queue of hard-working people trying to make their way back to England. When you hear people today, because of the COVID, complaining that you can't get out of the country, it just shows you the difficulties that they had getting out of the country and getting in. They just had to join these huge queues. And maybe they were in the queues for 2 days. Right?
John, just out of interest, what's the vessel on the far side? Or would you know what it was? It looks interesting.
The Hibernia, I assume.
No, I beg your pardon. The small vessel on the far pier.
Oh, yeah, it's one of our naval boats.
Okay.
What's the name of it? not a destroyer, not a frigate, smaller than a frigate.
Corvette.
We had three of them.
Yeah, Red
A
Corvette.
Corvette.
Yeah.
That was it. Yeah. They gave us very good service, the three Corvettes.
Yeah, there was an
And there, of course, is a classic.
Yeah. And two others, Ola, I think it was.
That's it. And there, of course, you have again one of the Scotia class. Now, I photographed Scotia in Dunleary Harbour. I don't. I should have looked up the date, 1940. But they shortly after I photographed her, the British Navy grabbed her, straightened her up, and she went into Dunkirk. And under great difficulty, she made the main quay wall in Dunkirk. And she loaded 4,000 to 5,000 wounded and prisoner soldiers in a very bad state, French and British. And then she pulled round and attempted to come out. And two Stukas latched into her, and they got two bombs right down the chimney. And they blew the bottom out of her, and she sank with a tremendous loss of life. And that was sort of a couple of weeks after I photographed her in Dunleary Harbour. That was the Scotia. Scotia was a sister of hers and a lovely ship. But then that's the awful point of war is you have to hit the others, even though they're starving prisoners. You have to hit them because if they get them home, they'll polish them up and rearm them. And that's the view of these modern people who like to fight wars. So you have to kill the unfortunates who are desperately trying to get home. But that's for another day. You still have those who like to start a war. That's the end of my show for tonight. I gather you're probably bored stiff, but I hope you enjoyed a little.
Not in the least. It was great, John.
I hope you enjoyed
Well
it.
done. Well done.
Fantastic.
Well done, John.
Good.
Thank you, John, for sharing.
You can give
Oh,
back to me.
Brilliant. A tour of the
Excellent,
fort.
John.
Very good. As long as I keep a few of you happy.
Yeah.
And none of you have none of you are waving the white flag and sort of retreating.
Very good.
Desperation. But
We're all
that's
here still, John.
They're all here.
Yeah.
That's how it was in the emergency years.
Yeah.
Not to be confused with the Second World War years. The emergency in Ireland happened from 1946 and 7. Food really went very bad in those years. But unlike England, we had tons of beef and tons of sausages. The one thing that we hadn't got is tea. And eventually a great smuggling business started across the border, and tea was the gold digger at that time. And of course, the North, you see, had a shocking law. Any eggs, sausage, or meat, sides of bacon or sides of beef in the North had to be handed in to the central depot. And it was converted to, there was a name for it, like spam or something like that.
Yeah.
And then your eggs had to be stamped, and they were converted into egg powder. So Northern people and English people used land in Ireland for a proper meal. In other words, a big steak and onions, and which they couldn't get in England. Steak, of course, had gone completely off the table in England. And of course, as a Belfast woman told me, a roundy egg was gold dust in the North. All the eggs were collected turned into egg powder, and you were given a ration of 10 ounces of egg powder for the week. And it was awful. I tasted it. So that was 1945 to 1948. And that was the year the great crowds went to England to work, to rebuild the country of England. England, of course, was laid waste. Many cities were absolutely flattened. with
We're
Hitler
still bringing sausages and rashers over to England as well, John, because I remember brothers of mine going in the 70s. The order
absolutely.
would be that real rashers and real sausages were
Real
to be brought
sausages
over.
and real rashers, that went on for,
Yep.
and in some
It's still
places
going
even
on.
still goes on. Yeah.
Friend of ours, we bring over, we get them vacuum packed here and bring them over to her in London. She's based in London. She wants real sausages.
I was present one day on the Northern train when we stopped at the customs at Gorawood, and there was a huge lady sitting across from me with a huge front, and a miserable little bastard of a customs man came in, and laughingly, he did the thing that would get him arrested today. He got her in a sort of a wrestling effort with his arms around her and pulled her to him. And she erupted in a language, you miserable little, and I won't repeat the rest of the worship. And the next thing, the front of her dress, it was customs, it was summertime. The front of her dress was quite destroyed. And of course, inside it, she had a special bra and about a dozen eggs, roundy eggs, for which she could get great money, or maybe they were for her own family. But this poor individual was going home with a dozen lovely eggs. And this bastard caught her and pulled her to him in a squashing hug. And there she was with her blouse, with the egg yolk dripping out of everywhere. And the language was, I learned some new words that day. And I felt like helping her. But that was the way life was. This miserable little bastard paid a pittance to be a customs man, sort of taking on a fat lady, getting home a dozen eggs.
John, she wasn't fat. It was just the eggs made her look that way.
Well, a normal woman couldn't do it. You know, she had to have a great big front. And the eggs sat happily. If she'd have stayed long enough, they might have hatched.
We're going back to your sausages there. We're coming back from the Model Railway exhibition in Glasgow there a couple of years back with Kevin Thornbury, and he had a couple of sausages, and he gave out hell about the sausages, and he explained that the sausages in Ireland had X amount of meat and whatever was made.
That's right, quite different specifications.
And the English and the Scottish, they have it the reverse. So let's say the meat content would be about 70% of meat in a sausage, where over there it'd be only about 30%, and then the rest of it was cardboard, as he said.
Yeah, they called them bangers.
Yeah, you get no bang off them anyway, that's for sure, unless you come to Ireland. I have another question for you.
How long was I? An hour? Oh, that's not too bad.
I have one more question for you, John.
Yes, certainly.
You mentioned European Motors in Balls Bridge as being the generating station for the trams.
Yeah.
Would that be for Balls Bridge Motors is today?
Yeah. I have photographs of it. You know, they had 4 main boilers. These are huge yokes. And reciprocating engines driving the generators on the floor. And when you passed there today, you couldn't believe that sort of this lovely generating station was belting away. I think first of all, Mercedes cars moved in.
Yeah.
And all my lovely gear was chopped up and broken and brought out. I have a photograph of the generator. It was a single generator, but a huge one. And there you
It's funny when you were talking about the Stena line. I have a memory of going over to England with John Byrne on one occasion, and
that was a dangerous occupation, with John.
Yeah, and Alf Walsh as well. But John, were you not on this trip as well, Connor? You might have been. We were up on the bridge.
I might have been. And
it was a stormy night. It was blowing force 8 or 9 up the Irish Sea.
Yeah, green water used come up on the bridge of the Stena, which is a peculiar thing.
There was a tiny little steering wheel, and
Yeah.
a wave would hit the bow of the boat and she'd swing. And
Yeah.
then you see this tiny little wheel spinning back. It was,
Yeah, but she was sitting on top of the sea. She wasn't in the sea, the Stena boats.
no.
They used to sit on top. I used to associate them with biscuit tins. Jacob's biscuit tins had the same effect if you threw it on the water. Tony, you're very quiet. You haven't started a row. No one started a row yet.
I remember going off on the Cambria and the Hibernia a lot when I came to Ireland first, because I lived in Dunleary.
This is the diesel ones.
Oh, the diesel ones, yeah.
They came in 47.
Yeah, much earlier. Yeah, but the later ones, the ones I remember now, the Hibernia looked to be slightly bigger than the Cambria. When the other two, the earlier boats, the Cambria and the Hibernia, were they identical, or did they have their individual?
Oh no, the four of them were identical. Yeah.
They were always very fast. They were the fastest merchant boats.
Yeah, they were very, very capable sea boats. You see, that meant that they put their nose into the wave and ploughed through it.
Oh yeah.
Now, that meant that you, in the third class compartment, which invariably was over the screws at the back, that meant that you got thrown around up and down, like 10 feet at a time.
Yeah.
The boat went up and the stern came down. And of course, unfortunately, as I remember it, a lot of the guys going back took in quite a quantity of stout and other things, leaving them. And of course, after 5 minutes of this, they threw up. And this was all over the floor. And you stepped on it and slid and finished up on your bum. And your clothes ruined.
That's right.
That's why the doors were always about 8 inches off the deck.
Yeah.
So nothing came out of the doorway.
And when that boat landed at Holyhead, a sort of a wreckage got off it. And fellas with Burberry coats of a type were very popular then. You know, when your nice white Burberry coat, when you went down and sat on this stuff, your Burberry coat was in a shocking mess. So they came down the gangway, sort of dirty, tired, and sick all down the front. And you never saw such a bunch in your life.
And the cardboard case.
And the cardboard case, yeah.
I still have one of them up in
Yeah.
the attic.
And sometimes there was nothing in the cardboard case. You just had to have it to see that you had a bit of property.
Dirty clothes.
I was always fascinated.
The fellow with the no case, you see, he had nothing.
Yeah, had it all in his pocket. The suit he bought at the beginning of the week.
You had but of course it was a great racket going home, and very often very true. If the fella came home with quite a lot of presents for the family in Donegal. But of course, when it came time to go back, he hadn't a penny. He had to borrow 5 shillings from his father. And sometimes he brought the cardboard case, which was very easy to carry, and he had nothing in it.
Yeah.
Maybe the mammy had knitted him a pair of socks or something like that, and that was always in it.
Oh, it was great.
But
There was a pillow. It was great for a pillow. Sleeping under a
in ways they were terrible days. In other ways that people enjoyed them, but they were rough.
Yeah.
And then the Irish mail from Holyhead to London was out on its own. I mean, when all these tired, dirty paddies got off in Holyhead and waiting on the platform, was probably a Royal Scot with 12 coaches, 13 coaches, and all these dirty paddies smelling and what have you, loaded in, sort of the compartment seated 5 aside, and that'd be 10 in the compartment, and they'd probably finish up with 13 or 14 in each compartment. And everyone tired and half of them falling asleep, and then they'd head off for And then, of course, the main stop was Bletchley. Bletchley had a great big cafeteria on the platform. And the one thing I used to enjoy in Bletchley, the mugs had straight sides, and they were put together 4 deep on a marble platform, like 10 yards long of them. And this huge woman with a huger teapot, maybe 5 gallons, used to come along from the start and go woo, and back again and back again. And she used to prepare like somewhere near 100 cups of tea. And of course, a poor ignorant Paddy who did, I don't want any sugar in mine. And he'd be told to feck off. Any sugar going was put in the teapot, and any milk going was put in the teapot. And it was sort of out of order to comment that you wanted more sugar or you didn't want sugar or what have you. But this flanks of lovely railway mugs used to be filled by this woman in minutes. She was filled, there was probably 4 deep and maybe 20 or 30 of them in depth, like 100 cups in minutes. And when the train stopped, the train of course stopped basically for water. And on one particular famous way, there was 2 4-for-0s, there was 2 water towers. And they got out, and with the help of this lady, you only had sort of 3 minutes, 4 minutes to get the famous British Railway sandwich, which was a thing of its own, and your mug of tea. And you swallowed your mug of hot tea and you took your sandwich back to the train. And she got sort of what we call a little light meal for 300 people in 4 minutes. It was amazing. I can still see her, these huge, I don't know where they got the huge women, but they always had one for this huge teapot. And the whole huge teapot, as I say, could load 30 mugs on a run and then back again. It's great stuff. And all of that is gone.
John, going back to your cardboard suitcases, as a kid, I was always fascinated by the customs guys, and they put some sort of logo on in different colored chalk. And to me, as a small kid, I was always fascinated. You know, it could be orange or red or blue or green when they were checking your case on through.
Oh, that's so. Some of those, a lot of the customs fellas were sort of baskets who looked after themselves, you know. If there was something in your case that he liked, it wasn't a case of a customs that sort of offended the customs regulator. He took it for himself. You know, there was no controls. So if you had a little tie for your son or something like that, a natty little thing, he just thought, you can't bring that in, bang. And he put it on the counter behind him. But it was for himself he was taking it, not for the great royal state.
John, your story about the mugs reminds me of a funny incident I experienced. I was on a rail trip in Germany, and there was an English guy on it. And we used to stop at various stations to change trains. So he'd order a ½ liter of beer, and he had this blow-up mug, and he'd blow it up. If we were getting near departure time, he'd blow the mug up and empty the mug of beer into it to bring it on the train with him for the next leg.
Quite so, yeah. So there, any more questions?
No, John, I have a recollection of tea cups being filled like that, not mugs, but cups being filled like that in Woolworths in Henry Street back in the late 50s, early 60s. And it became an expression in our household that I'm sure, put the mugs up there and we'll fill them with a Woolworths special. Right? And my poor mother would lose her life thinking that somebody was going to go,
okay.
There you go, Ron.
Yeah.
So there we are. I think I'll leave you to it, and I hope I gave you a little bit to look at.
Oh, brilliant, John.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John.
Thanks a million. Great stuff.
Great bit of history there.
At my age, I should have had it in better order or things like that, but I don't just get round to that sort of stuff.
It was great.
Still perfect, John. It's still fine. Don't worry.
Okay.
Fine, John. It was
Yeah,
fantastic.
it's brilliant.
Very good. Anyway,
Wonderful photographs as well, John.
Yeah.
Photographs.
in your
Thanks for
dreams,
that.
like the fellow in Tralee, you can go down to the Nanton Pillar and get your great big Dublin tram.
Yes.
But it's only in your dreams. You have today to take a tram, which is either built in Japan or built in Korea or what have you, on the Dart.
Yeah.
And it gives me a pain in the face. All of those should have been built in Dublin. Okay, boys, I'll depart and have a cup of tea.
Very good, John.
And forgive me. And
Thanks, John.
I'll try and make a better formation the next night and
John, it was great.
and start a row. I didn't start a row tonight. A bit disappointed that
And like the tea on the platform, you have to pour it from about 2 foot distance, John.
that's it.
When
That's
you're
it.
making
Conor.
that mug.
And let it mature nicely as well.
Yeah.
What?
So you can put a mouse on the surface.
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh no, I still remember the Bletchley with the big marble platform. It was out of this world. And the place was lit by probably what were 2 45-watt bulbs on the platform with steam wafting down, you see, and you walked into steam or you walked out of steam as you made your way for your mug. And then there was a traveling 4-wheeled yoke where you put your, and funny enough, everyone put their mugs happily, but no one went to swipe all the mugs, you know. They put them happily back on this trolley.
John,
Yeah,
be more honest than a poor man.
absolutely, yeah.
Well, John, there was at least one LMS teaspoon in our household.
Yeah.
Oh,
that's where they went to.
That's where they all went down. There we know, Dirty.
Okay, boys, I'll say good night.
Night, John.
And you can punch. I was going to say you can punch each other, but of course you're not near each other at all.
It's very disappointing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, good night, boys.
Thanks, John.
Stay safe.
Thanks a million.
That was very interesting.
Brilliant.